Mutation rates bust the evolutionary timeline. I'm here with Matt from Team SFT, Standing for Truth, and he's going to show us how our scientific observations of the mutation rates in humans and in animals points to it's a bust the evolutionary timeline and points to a very young creation of people and animals. So, Matt, take it away.
All right. Yeah, this one's going to be interesting for a lot of people. A lot of you that might be following our work know that we bring up mutations all the time. And a lot of the critics use the same arguments against us all of the time. Today, we're going to clear that up and why I believe this is the most important subject of all of them when it comes to the debate. And what debate is that? Share my screen for me, please. I believe mutation rates are the most important aspect of all of this because mutations are how we explain the diversity of life on Earth. So if mutation rates are fast and evolution says they're slow, that changes everything because that means that evolution can't answer the diversity of life we see on Earth. And it puts a time limit and a restriction on that life. So how are we going to do this? We're going to start off by saying modern humans supposedly evolved around in Africa about 200,000 years ago because of a bottleneck. And if you go and you check AI straight on Google, yeah, modern humans arose in Africa around, about 200,000 to about 300,000 years ago. The interesting thing is when they go and they look for evidence of this mythical supposed bottleneck in their geologic record, what they believe is 200,000 years ago, they find nothing. But yet it slashed the population down to the point where primitive man went in and modern day came out. So what did it? A meteor strike, a volcano? We don't know. So today we're going to be looking at phylogenetic mutation rates. The evolutionary theory predicted slow based on evolution and the fossils. We predicted fast based on the biblical timeline. We're going to show you by the end of this that the evidence that we get is the exact opposite of what they present to you. That's why when you go into Google and you type in how they're humans, you get, they evolved in Africa about 300,000 years ago. So why would they hide the actual evidence that we observe as opposed to what we're actually seeing and the story that they wield to us? Because what they do is known as calibration. They go back and they said, well, we split and diverged from a primate ancestor about 7 million, 6 million years ago. We don't know. It could be up to 14. Just throw out numbers. Anyway, that split created the lineage to humans today. So therefore, lots of diversity should have arisen during that time. And what you're going to find out today is that it did not arise, and it's really confusing to the evolutionary community. And how do I know? Because they literally state that. It is thought we split from a common ancestor from chimps 5 to 6 million years ago, more than enough time for substantial genetic differences to develop. They haven't developed. So if you check AI again, make sure. Don't just believe me. Look, yes, evolutionary biologists often use the fossil record to calibrate these phylogenetic mutation rates. So that what they're doing is they're looking through the lens of deep time. This is the only view that they're ever taught. When you're in school, this is all you ever learn. So it's no surprise they all believe the same thing. So don't be shocked that everyone's like, oh my gosh, is this some kind of conspiracy? No, it's no conspiracy. It's the only thing you've ever learned. It's like being shocked that everyone speaks English in America. It's like, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Anyway, Charles Lyell started this agenda a long time ago. So what did we actually find? This is what really shocked the entire evolutionary community. And they admit this. I know skeptics say no, but I don't really care what they think. The reality is the first ever observed pedigree study, which was about 11 generations deep by Howell in 1996, he observed there was about one substitution that arose in the population about one every 25 generations. This was extremely fast, especially compared to the evolutionary expectation that there should be one every 590. You talk about a difference. That's a huge difference. And it's so vast, a matter of fact, that they actually didn't even know what to say about this. Howell had actually read about a study that was done prior to this, but it wasn't a pedigree. It was a mathematical study done by Lundstorm in like 1992. And he was the first one to document it. And so Howell decided to test that. He said, let's actually get a pedigree. So he got this family that went 11 generations deep. And he goes, sure enough, that number is actually correct. And so the critics come along and they go, you forgot about selection. So
Wait,
Let's
Matt,
see.
I want to stop you right here just to explain to people because I think there's a lot of people who have never heard anything about this. Okay, so
Oh, sure.
what's the difference between you said they're using their assumptions, right? They assumed that we had like we split off from a common ancestor, 6 million years ago. And
Yep.
so they're using that assumption when they factor their dates for
Correct.
when humans arose, right?
Right.
That's where they're getting it. So they're not getting that from anything scientifically observed, right?
Right, exactly. They're trusting the fossil record and the assumption of a split rather than the observed evidence. So what they're doing is they're mixing the two at this point. They look inside the humans and they go, how many differences are there? And they go, well, in the D loop region, there's about 14. So how long did it take to get 14? They go, well, if we go 14 divided by 7 million years, how many mutations should arise in that 17 million years? That's the mutation rate. Maybe one every, what was it? Right here, 590 generations, you get one that arises. Then it's got to drift to fixation. So that's the tricky part, right? It might just arise, but it sure might not fix. So now they say, see, now we have a very slow rate. That's what we're expecting to find if a split occurred. Instead, it was extremely rapid. So what's going on? They need a very recent bottleneck to deal with this evidence. And they also need selection to work. And that's why the critics say you're forgetting about selection. And when you forget about selection, it slows those rates down. Today, you're going to learn that that is not the case. But first, I need to show you something, a study done by Agnar Helgason. I use his name because he does massive amounts of pedigree mutation rate studies, by the way. He's like, more than 50% of them. I don't know. He's addictive. But anyway, this mutation rate study was only done last year, 2024. And it surveyed 119,211 people. It's the largest pedigree you can ever find. He
And
found
for people
something.
who are watching, can you explain the difference between a pedigree study and what the evolutionists are doing?
Oh, yeah, sorry. A
Yes.
pedigree sounds almost like an animal study, like a pedigree with dogs. But in reality, a pedigree study only means um, a pedigree of ancestry, meaning like a grandmother was tested, and then the daughter was tested, and then the great granddaughter was tested. And what they're testing is to look for new mutations in each generation to determine how many arise. So it's a pedigree rate, it's the observable rate. We go back as far as we can in a lineage and we say, okay, that's the paternal ancestor. And this lineage accumulated 2 mutations over 20 generations. Now we have a pedigree mutation rate. A phylogenetic mutation rate isn't based on the observable evidence. It's based on the assumption of deep time and what's ranked on the fossil record. So they find a fossil of a bear, they calibrate the observed rate to the fossil date, and then they slow the rate down by any means necessary, whether or not they have to remove mutations and say, it must have been somatic, or maybe recombination happened in this area, even though it normally never does in the mitochondria, or maybe the mutation rolled over on itself and it shouldn't be and we're not counting it. There's so many different variables that go in, but no matter what, the observed rate never matches what we see in the fossil record. So that's the interesting part. That's what we're testing, ancestry. We're testing if the fossil record is true based on those dates by the observed data. The observed data never agrees with fossils, ever.
Yeah, and that's what I want people to understand, because if somebody starts Googling right now and they're like, what do mutation rates show? They're going to come up with all kinds of results that show mutation rates fitting the evolutionary timeline. And the reason you're going to find that if you Google it is because they are using their evolutionary assumptions. So what you need to look for is whether this is a pedigree study using the mutation rates from actual scientific observations, or if it's the phylogenetic one, because if they're using their phylogenetic trees, their evolutionary trees, then like Matt said, they're going to cook the books. They're going to make it fit the evolutionary timeline. And so that's what you have to be careful about.
Exactly. And here's the thing about that. So many studies are done out there that are pedigree and phylogenetic. It gets confusing. They might mix the two together as well. They might do a pedigree study and then combine it with a phylogenetic rate and say, look, we found the middle ground. No, you didn't. They do that constantly. It's inflation. You know what I mean? They're taking what we see and they're constructing their own story around it. Even Parsons did that. When he got his results for 6,500 years, he said, no one believes that's the case. It's impossible to explain human diversity in 6,500 years. Oh, really? Interesting. So because his view is evolutionary, meaning there was no bottleneck 6,500 years ago that could have wiped out all humans isolated on different islands to make a most recent common ancestor of a single female. And he's right. That's impossible in their scenario. But in our scenario, it's very probable. And that's what we're going to see today.
Now, can you explain why they say we had to have a bottleneck? Why is that important? Like, why did they say that? Mm-hmm.
It's important because bottlenecks reset genetic diversity. And what happens is when, imagine Paris Hilton is on a plane with her friends, and they love to carry those little tiny dogs with them, Chihuahuas. And they all have little Chihuahuas running around the airplane. They look out the window and they see a nuclear bomb go off. And they're like, oh my gosh. And it blows up everything and it wipes out all life down on Earth. And they just stay in their plane where it's safe before they land. And they finally land. All dogs are gone now. There's no wolves. There's no dogs. There's nothing. They land. That new Chihuahua is now the most recent common ancestor to all future dogs ever, because we can only trace their future to those Chihuahuas. You can't go back to the wolf anymore. That was before them. So they need a genetic bottleneck to reset diversity so that it makes the most recent common ancestor land on that date. So how could there be a most recent common ancestor in a 6,000 to 7,500 year time frame in any evolutionary model? It's impossible. I mean, you have Australia full of people that are isolated for 60, 50,000 years that didn't come into contact with people until very, very recently. But yet when we test their mitochondria, guess what? Their mitochondria mutation rate matches the same mutation rate as everybody else on Earth. That goes right back to 6,500 years or so. That's why they can't get away from this. They go, how is that possible? They come up with scenarios, maybe more bottlenecks or maybe massive amounts of inbreeding did it. That's what it did. Everyone just started inbreeding right at that time. So they come up with wild stories because they have to, because as you're going to see, selection is not going to save them. And this massive study is one of the ways that you're going to be able to tell how that's possible. So I hope that answers why they need a bottleneck, because without a bottleneck, you don't have a genetic reset. And without a genetic reset, then you should be going back hundreds of thousands of years to even millions, right? I mean, the new skull they just found of a Homo sapien dated 1.2 million years old or something in China and Asia. And well, that makes the mutation rate even worse now, because now you got to get out of the bottleneck and go back even further. They can't find the bottleneck to begin with. And now they got to push it back even further, because Homo sapiens aren't supposed to have arisen until 200,000 years ago. And that's in Africa, the motherland of the human diversity, the L haplogroup. Now it has to be removed and placed somewhere else. They will. We've already seen it, right? When we type it in now, they're already starting to change it on Google. So.
Okay. And so they need the bottleneck because for humans and for many other animals that we've tested, there's so few mutations that there had to be a reset.
Yes.
Like for the evolutionary timeline to be true, there had to be a reset, like you talked about with the Chihuahua on the airplane, right? Like there had to be a time when everything else got wiped out so that we'd only have those few mutations.
That's right. And here's an even more interesting part about that, because you're right. The genetic bottleneck reset the diversity in all life on Earth. All of it. It didn't miss anything. So explain to me how a crocodile or an alligator, this supreme creature on Earth, got a genetic bottleneck reset at the same time as humans. It makes no sense, because unless you want to go with our model, because there isn't anything in the very recent history. So there's very few differences and there's a rapid mutation rate. You can't have both of those and have deep time. It doesn't work. So that's why there's the conundrum. That's why it's a paradox. And then once you start looking at other factors outside of mutation rates that align with it, now the puzzle pieces begin to fit. Because you see, when you just give one piece of evidence like we're going to do today, everyone thinks we're going to be talking about humans. No. I'm going to show you animals that completely agree with the exact same thing, because that's what we said. This isn't a human-only problem. All animal life that's ever been tested shows exactly the same thing. They do not line up to the fossil record. The mutation rates are too fast, and genetic diversity is far too low. This is a huge problem for evolution, because they need to explain the diversity by mutations, and they can't do it. This study by Agnar Helgason here studied a massive amount of people, 119,211. And the cool part about this is that he noticed that the different regions of the mitochondria mutated at different speeds. Interesting. So we found the coding region mutates the slowest, followed by the control region, which mutates much faster, 8.3 times faster, actually. Then we found that the hypervariable region 1 inside the control region mutates even faster. Now, what is amazing about that is that here's that 8-point time mutation when you want to compare them to one another. And why does this matter? Because it's showing you that there's different clocks inside the MtDNA, including the MtDNA itself, that have different rates that they click. And if they tick at different rates, then what happens when we inspect different regions? Do we make different clocks from different regions? We absolutely do. And that's why when people say, you forgot about selection, oh, no, we didn't. We didn't forget about selection at all. Selection is a major factor in why we're looking at particular regions and not looking at others. So this would be if we decided to look at the entire mitochondria. Imagine if we looked at this clock and I told you between 10 and 12 right here, that's the only accurate measurement we get. When the minute hand hits here, it ticks per minute accurately, but the rest of the time, it doesn't. Would you say that makes a very good clock? No, you wouldn't use it as a clock at all, right? I mean, it's stupid. You would be like, no, that thing's 80%. That's wrong 80% of the time. Well, that's exactly what happens when we look at entire mitochondria mutation rate studies, because they have the coding region in it, and the coding region codes for proteins. So therefore, natural selection works very strong in the vast majority of that region. Now, what if I told you when we look at the D loop, this red indicates the amount of time that passes that's accurate. Every minute that ticks by at exactly 1 minute. But only about 10% of that region right here ticks randomly. It might tick backwards at one point. It might not tick at all. And then it continues to tick until it reaches here, and then it flows again. That's an 80% accurate clock, or 90%. It's pretty good, right? Much better than before. Yeah, you would trust that clock much more, wouldn't you? Well, how about when we look at the hypervariable region now? That's even more accurate. Now we say that there's only a few mutations in the entire hypervariable regions that mutate at all, and natural selection doesn't even see them. They're non-selectable. They think maybe some selection might be occurring there, so they add a little bit. They add like 2 to 5% selection in that area. That's how low it is. So when people say, we forgot about selection, no, we didn't forget about selection. We've accounted for it. That's why the experts use these regions and don't make pedigree substitution rate studies based on population-wide from entire mitochondria, MtDNA, and they specifically look at D loops and they look at hypervariable regions. So I made this image for everybody to show you the massive amount of mitochondria, with the D loop region being very small, about 1,122 base pairs. And then inside of that is the hypervariable region 1. It's only about 5% affected, maybe by mutations, but again, they're probably neutral. 7% in hypervariable region 2. Again, so if we look at hypervariable region 1, it's about 360 base pairs, and only about 19 of them turn over. That's it. And they're mostly neutral. And then we go to hypervariable region 2, only about 22 of them flip over on each other, but it's about 316 base pairs. So it's smaller. So the rate's probably a little bit faster there. But the mutations that occur there are functionally neutral. So how can you invoke selection happening in a neutral region where selection can't see them? It makes no sense. And that's why when we look at these studies, where do they look? They don't look at this region that's utterly trash, like the entire MtDNA. They know better. They're smart. They're geneticists. They go right to the D loop. Look at that. Right to the region that's going to accurately be much better as a clock. Our present results, as well as those of Lundstorm in 1992, suggest that either much more recent history of human origins, of modern humans, right? So that means he was testing for human origins. Or that maybe evolution on the mitochondrial genome is not a reliable evolutionary clock. So are these clocks wrong, or is evolution wrong? There's only two options. Today, you're going to find out why the evolutionary clock is wrong and why his and everyone else's rates land on the biblical timeline. This is devastating. Along came Thomas Parsons. He works as a forensic scientist for the FBI, and he has access to their blood bank. Him and his team performed the largest substitution rate blood test ever done worldwide among people to date. Even to this day, the diversity of people in his was the largest, although not the deepest pedigree. You're about to see what he tested. Oh my gosh, look at that. He tested the hypervariable regions inside the control region. The non-selectable region, the area where natural selection isn't constantly purging mutations because there's no protein coding action going on. There's only a little bit of transcription going on there. And so natural selection isn't worried about the area. The results that he got, as we talked about earlier, he said the most recent common ancestor, the very first woman, landed about 6,500 years ago. This sent shockwaves. And a lot of the critics came out and said, well, you only get that if you use the fastest rate. Really? That is actually not true at all. Because when we use the fastest rate, which came from the AFDL blood bank, you get a mutation rate of 1 every 17. That's much faster than what he published. What did he publish? Well, he published 1 out of every 33, which we see right here. 1 out of, actually, like 32.8. So it actually rounded up to 1 out of 33 in the published. So the reason he didn't publish the fast rate is because even though the majority of mutations were rapid, they were in the AFDIL blood bank, which showed mostly single generations, dyad and triad, meaning they did only go back 1 to 2 generations, and the rate was extremely fast. And the reason why is because they were probably counting somatic mutations, and most likely they were counting mutations that had not drifted yet up to the point where they could reach fixation. They also set a pool of about 10% where they can catch heteroplasmy. Anything below that, they couldn't really detect. So they were counting heteroplasmic mutations and they were counting somatic mutations. And they knew that they probably won't make it into the 6th generation because selection will have probably weeded them out. And they did, because they should have not been there to begin with, right? A somatic mutation isn't inherited through the germline, but when you're just looking at mutations, sometimes you can't tell. Is this somatic? We don't know. Let's test a couple generations and then we'll know. That's why they published their deepest pedigree, which was 6.4 generations deep. So no, Parsons was not a single or double pedigree mutation rate study only. And the ones that were rejected. They did not use them. They published their medium mean rate on the deepest pedigree they had, which was 6.4 generations. They also got some other unique samples, but the slowest they could obtain was 1 out of every 94 generations and 1 out of 80 in the Amish people. But these were cell lines. These weren't blood. And the blood bank was a lot more accurate in preservation and tells them more data. And as you'll see, everything in the future that we're going to be looking at all agrees with that 1 out of 33 range.
And of course, in the evolutionary timeline, you actually wouldn't be having those mutations frequently between generations. You would have you'd have lots of generations in between a mutation.
560 generations before you see one. You would never be able to determine who killed anybody because 10,000 years would have to pass before one mutation even arose. And then it might not even get passed on.
So our observations and what we actually use for crimes, like solving crimes and things, depends on the shorter mutation rates, not the evolutionary mutation rates.
Correct. Exactly. What's used in the field by the FBI is what we see, is what we observe, is what we test. They don't use evolutionary timelines at all. Why? Because they don't work. They're mythical. They're garbage. They don't work. Nobody uses the phylogenetic rate to do anything. Why not? If it's true and it's accurate, clearly it could. That's why Nathaniel Jensen challenged anybody. He said, if you pick an animal We'll use our laboratory and run a mutation rate because his laboratory can. And we'll run a mutation rate. You make a prediction. I'll make a prediction on what its mutation rate is. We'll predict when the most recent common ancestor for that species lived. No one has taken him up on that debate or on that challenge. And he said that to Venema, I forget his name, that works for BioLogos in their debate. He said, you can pick any animal and I'll challenge you head to head on a prediction on a mutation rate. And Venema said, that's actually really impressive. You know, that's something evolution cannot do. So if it can't make accurate testable predictions, then it's not a very good model either, is it? So
right.
Then, well, guess what? A lot of people criticize Parsons. One in particular, his name was Holland. And he said, I don't think that you actually did the mutation rate study right. There's no possible way that can be true. So he joined him the following year and they reran the numbers on a totally different set of blood samples and everything for the FBI. They got one substitution every 30.6 generations, confirming it was extremely fast and literally confirming, even for a critic in front of his own eyes, he goes, nope, that's true. That's accurate. So what did Ann Gibbons in her DNA interactive report titled Calibrating the Mitochondrial Clock? This guy said, using the new clock, she would be a mere 6,000 years old. Uh-oh. That's not good. Zero. That's literally what the young Earth creationists were talking about. Why does that matter? Again, the neutral regions, the rate at which new mutations arise is the mutation rate. And the rate at which these new mutations get fixed becomes the common allele is the substitution rate. So you hear Donnie often say the mutation rate is the substitution rate. What he means by that is that rate is exactly the same in neutral regions. So when we're talking about entire mitochondrial MtDNA, no, it is not equal. So that is not how it works. We're talking about the D loop, specifically hypervariable regions. The D loop does undergo a few, but not much. So again, it's very close to a neutral region, but the hypervariable regions are. So here's a visual I made to help everybody understand it. The selection pressure is weakest in hypervariable regions and the strongest in the mitochondrial DNA, MtDNA coding regions. So here in this region, most purifying selection makes a pretty bad clock. The control region, low purifying selection makes a better clock. Hypervariable regions, weakest selection makes the best clock. Very simple. And when Parsons published this, he stated, the observed substitution rate from both the blood samples and cell lines greatly exceed evolutionary rates inferred by phylogenetic studies, meaning they do not align. So why, when you type into Google, do you get 200,000 years, 300,000 years from when you ask when mankind came alive? The observational evidence doesn't agree with it. The visual evidence doesn't agree. They only tell you the story version and what we don't observe because they have an agenda. And so why does this matter? Because evolution theory is based on mutations. If mutation rates are fast and they require them to be slow, everything changes. This is Parsons. This is their personal perception. And Gibbons, right? No one thinks that's the case. But at what point should models switch from MtDNA time zones to another? Like what? Okay, they're going fast right now. Okay, well, what if they were going slower 5,000 years ago? What if they were different? See, it's not a very good clock then, is it? If you can just invoke that something happened and the clock doesn't work anymore, but when the region is neutral, you can't say that selection changed the clock, right? And by the way, this is Ann Gibbons. She is not a creationist by any means. She only writes on evolutionary content. Look at what she wrote. By solving the mysteries of the Romanov remains, that's what Parsons did, by the way, raised another puzzle that first troubled forensic experts and is now worrying evolutionists. Wait a minute. I thought we were the only ones that use that term. In the 90s, did they refer to themselves as evolutionists? Were they not actually not ashamed of the title? Because they sure get mad when you call them that now. Why? I don't know. They believe in evolution. They're evolutionists. We believe in creation. We're creationists. I don't get offended by it. Whatever. So it could also be it could also complicate the lives of evolutionary scientists. Who use MtDNA rates as a clock to date such key events when human ancestors spread around the globe. Evolutionists, there it is again, have assumed that the clock is constant, ticking off mutations every 6,000 to 12,000 years or so. Regardless of the case, evolutionists are most concerned about the effect of a much faster mutation rate. Why? They should be. That's why.
Now, let me give a little bit of pushback in what, somebody might challenge on, okay? So, like, they might say, well, why couldn't we assume? We know that things happen, that can cause mutation rates to change. So, why would we assume that the clock always ticked that way?
Because if it changed by what mechanism? The only thing that can change a neutral region would be selection or a bottleneck. And since we're looking at an area where there is no selection really happening, you can't invoke that. If they invoke a bottleneck, they probably need evidence for it. And since there's no bottleneck when the most recent common ancestor of these timelines occurred, they have to now admit that the clock is wrong. I don't know how, or the timeline was wrong. They admitted those are the only two cases that we have. Remember, right here.
Okay, but we creationists like to say, hey, you can't always assume what happened in the past based on what's happening today. So we're right now, we're not seeing selection take out these mutations in that region. But what if this was different in the past? I mean, if evolution is true, we're building everything up from the ground with mutations. So mutations have a lot of power, right? So, I mean, we don't know what could have happened.
Right. So, okay, now we have to invoke that a region that starts getting mutations inside of it are now all of a sudden dangerous. In a neutral region, they become dangerous. So selection has to see that and now remove it. How could we invoke that the dangerous mutations were coming in over that random time frame over tens of thousands or millions of years, but have now stopped? Why would they have stopped when humans are more damaging to themselves than at any other time in history? We're around radiation. We're eating foods we've never eaten. We're around toxic chemicals. We're breathing in plastics. We're eating out of chemicals that we've never touched. If there's anything that's going to mutate us faster, it's right now. And yet we're seeing the mutation rate move at a neutral rate across generation after generation after generation. Now, our grandparents had less. Why wasn't their mutation rate slower or faster? It was the same because the region is the same and they're neutral still. And we go back 6 generations, it's the same. We go back 40 generations, which is a pedigree mutation rate study we're going to get into, where the maternal ancestor lived in 1410. And guess what? It was still the same. Uh-oh. We can't invoke that it was super different 10,000 years before that if it's always been the same in that region every time we've looked at it across every generation and including every animal we've looked in. Clearly, one animal, like an alligator, survived a bottleneck and multiple varieties of them lived, right? Which we can trace back at least 10,000 years or a million years. Nope, they were all wiped out. Isn't that interesting? Exactly like the Bible says. And the mutation rate is neutral in their regions as well. So interesting.
Yes. Okay. Now, final pushback, because I think I've heard this where like people will say, why do you guys like that one region so much? You like that region because it gives you a fast mutation rate. And that's what you need for the creation model. So we're choosing that region, not because it's a better clock, but because we like it for our rates.
Cherry picking. You guys cherry pick Parsons because his got you the results that you want to get. I even have a slide for that. The reason I'm ready to go. Oh, why would we choose Parsons? Because remember, they said it's only the fastest rate. Want I prove? No, it's not the fastest rate. He chose the middle ground. We like Parsons because he chose the most diverse people group. Which, when you're trying to get a population-wide substitution rate, don't you think you should test Africans and Asians and British? Probably, right? So that's why we cherry pick Parsons. But guess what? Every one of these studies is in agreement. Uh-oh, could it be we're going to go over those today? We are. So we don't actually cherry pick anything except for the best we can find to give the best answers we can give. And when we say we cherry picked a region, you're damn right we did, just like the geneticists did. They know what they're doing. And we're not going to look at the entire mitochondria because we've already confirmed that selection is happening there and they won't make a good clock. So there's too much inference. Can we still land on a biblical timeline? Of course we can. Nathaniel Jensen has done that. But I'm not going to defend his pedigree mutation rate study because it's only a single generation and selection can remove some. He wanted to land directly on 6,000 years. Go ahead. You can defend that. You can debate that all you want. But I'm going to look at the areas that are neutral. And when they're neutral, that means that the substitution rate equals the fixation rate, which means now when a substitution arises, we don't have to just assume, well, the mutation arose. Now, how long is it going to take to drift to the point where it's fixed? That can take millions of years. Oh, really? It doesn't in neutral regions because the substitution rate does equal the fixation rate. So we don't have to change the date at all. It equals the same time frame in neutral regions. But if we were to test the entire mitochondrial, we can't rely on that answer now because we have to take into account selection. So are we cherry picking? Yeah, you're damn right I am. I'm cherry picking the best region we can ever look at, and I don't care what the results give. I only care about what are the answers and what are true. The answers could be off. They could be completely off, and I will have no way to refute and argue with the evidence simply because I can't invoke selection, just like our opponents can't invoke it. That's why the critics are out. Look at what they say. 2000, he concluded selection is unlikely to be a major factor that underlines the difference between the phylogenetic and pedigree mutation rates. At this point, the results suggest that selection has not preferentially distorted the pedigree mutation rate spectrum relative to the phylogenetic one. They admit that selection isn't doing it. Why? Because they know that.
Was that a quote from Parsons?
No, that was a quote by Howell.
Howell
right here.
Okay.
Neil Howell. And in 2003, this is in his study. He quoted this guy. I'm not even going to begin to pronounce his name. His first name is Sigurdardottir. That's about as far as I can get.
Okay.
I'd have to hear his name before I butcher that.
That list of studies, none of those are names of creationists. For those who are watching, this is just secular, peer-reviewed mitochondrial mutation rate studies.
Correct. That's all we're looking at here. We're going by the peer-reviewed literature. They admit this. And when we look and listen to what they say themselves about selection, they're admitting that selection can't save the day. So why do our critics bring it up? I think our critics are locked in the mindset that we're just talking about the entire mitochondria, but we're not. We're hyper-focusing on particular regions in that mitochondria that make the best clock because they're near neutral. Otherwise, we're just guessing. We're just like, well, maybe they will get wiped out in time. Well, that's speculative. We don't want speculative. We want as clear and concise as can be. So they admit, look, the mitochondria control region, that's the word, control region, has a higher evolutionary rate and tends to be under weaker purifying selection than protein coding genes. Surprise, surprise, exactly what we're talking about. In general terms, the hypervariable DNA region is one with low selective pressure, allowing for a great number of substitution and indels in the mitochondria. So again, what do they say? It's rather the phylogenetic estimate that may be biased. Did they admit that? What? It's clear, not opinion, that the pedigree rates provide a direct estimate of the true mutation rate. And despite their allure, we must sadly conclude that all divergence estimates discussed here are without merit. Our advice to the reader is whenever you see a time estimate in the evolutionary literature, demand uncertainty. Oh no. Did they just throw themselves under the proverbial rug? You're right, they did. Now, some people say, well, maybe Parsons and Neil Howell published this, by the way. He said, well, maybe they counted somatic mutations. Somatic mutations are untenable. Newly arising mutations were detected in multiple family members and thus cannot be somatic. So they waited enough generations to get the discern when something was somatic and when it was not. There's a general perception that there is a competition to get the oldest date, and there's kudos in it. Interesting. Interesting how much they admit when they don't think there's a creationist listening. So back to where we were. I got off on a tangent. So now we have Holland, and Holland himself here was a critic of Parsons and joined his team, and they confirmed the rate was exactly the same, actually a little bit faster, but it doesn't matter. Up and down a couple hundred years, who cares, right? The rate is extremely fast. We're talking way too fast and landing on the biblical timeline. This was published by the FBI. This is a book written on it, and the results are used by the forensic analysis by the FBI to this day. So again, are we cherry picking? No, not necessarily. But when I bring up pedigree mutation rates, I point to Parsons because of the amount of diversity he had in it. And though it's not the deepest, I can change that up in the future because this guy triggers everybody. I'm going to start talking about somebody else. But let's keep going. Here's one. And this was published around like 2001 or something. Look at this. The report 0.25 reported by Howell in 1996, 0.25 or 28 reported by Parsons in 1997. This rate got the overall exactly the same. One mutation every 25 to 40 generations. Exactly within the exact same window as the same conclusions of Howell and Parsons. Oh my goodness. And this was much later, by the way. So how about Heyer? Heyer et al., her team in 2001. This pedigree is the deepest one I've ever seen. It ranges from 4 up to 89 maternal generations. Clearly enough time for selection to clearly impact the mutation rate. For hypervariable region 1, we obtained 6,600 years. For hypervariable region 2, we obtained 276 generations, or 8,250 years. Combining HBR1 with 2, that's what you do. You get the middle ground. The middle is 7,425 years ago, or 247 generations at the midpoint. But remember, Parsons used a 20-year generation time. She used a 30-year generation time. When you lower that to Parsons, the most recent common ancestor in her study lived 4,940 years ago.
Wow. That's amazing.
It gets worse. In 2012, Lorena Madrigal ran her own study, basically identical to Parsons yet again. She said the rate is 13 to 42 times higher than most phylogenetic estimates for HBR1, and then gives a range. And as you can see, her rate right here, the range, remember above, it was 0.25. Look at that. Parsons, exactly the same rate again, right in the 0.0256. And what was the one I showed earlier with Sigurdardottir? 0.025, 0.028, and she got 0.0256. They're all getting the same results, no matter how deep the pedigree. So when you compare the low and high, Parsons used a 20-year generation time, about 6,500 years for Eve. Madrigal had a 25-year, basically the same thing, 6,447, basically online. Madrigal dropped to a 20-year generation time, though, same as Parsons, drops the most recent common ancestor down to 5,149 years ago. I would say that's more accurate. And the reason I would say this is more accurate is because you got to remember, these pedigree studies are looking at particular genealogies. So this might be the most recent common ancestor to, let's say, what was this one? Deep Costa Rican pedigree. Obviously, Eve wasn't a Costa Rican. So the Costa Rican pedigree actually went back. They found the most recent common ancestor for that in particular lineage was around 4,000 or 1410 AD is when they lived, but they went further back in genealogies, way far, and they concluded that the common ancestor, all of those people, every one of the Costa Rican people, was about right in this range of 6,474 years ago, if you use a 25-year generation time. But it gets worse. In 2005. Christina Santos ran a very good study. She noticed that there was 11 substitutions after 321 generations. That lands at around one mutation every 29 generations in the D loop, by the way, the typical region we look in. And that's exactly in line with in between Howell and right around Parsons. We have 2022, a very recent study. She noticed that these rates were 16 times higher than the phylogenetic estimates, yet again, with heteroplasmy detection in 13 samples accounted for. And she provided one of the first pedigree-derived rates for the entire MtDNA genome. And guess what? One substitution every 38 generations for the D loop. Exactly the same. And then we can go just as recent as last year. And we have Agnar Helgason, the Viking man himself over here, when we look at the control region, he had some HVR1 rates as well, but the control region is good enough for me. It's close enough. Who cares? He got a mutation rate in line with Parsons, yet again, with the most recent common ancestor, 7,090 years ago, directly in line with all the others, around 1 every 36 generations, time and time again. But I decided to run our own study. So Donnie and I were like, let's do something unique, something that creationists aren't really doing, and put it on the line. And let's run our own mutation rate study based on the lowest and the highest that we can find. We'll narrow it right in the middle. And then we're going to find the most diverse people on Earth. And I was able to do that. I tracked this study down right here and find that hypervariable region in 1 and 2 in combination had the maximum diversity in African samples up to 14.1. So now we have the maximum number we need to know for the control region, for the hypervariable regions. We noticed, so right here, 14 max substitutions in the D loop, hypervariable region 1, 6 fixed, hypervariable region 2, about 8. And our study is right here. This will be published later on Standing for Truth website, but you can see the results already. With a substitution rate of 0.029, which is 1 generation every 34.48. That's using very mild terms. We didn't use the fastest by any means. We get about with the divergence of 14.1 divided by 2 lineages, we get 241 generations ago. Now, 241 generations times a 25 to 30 year generation time lands about 6,500 years ago, with a 95% confidence between 6,000 and 7,230. And as if you guys know our model at all, you know that the Bible that everyone really talks about is putting the timeline directly at 6,000 years, and then there was a global flood 4,400 or so years ago. But they're also neglecting that there was also a deeper, older version of the Bible that's called the Septuagint, and it places the creation at 7,500 years ago and a flood at 5,360 years ago. And so those are the time frames that we're trying to land on. You know, if anything is going to be true, it's probably going to land us within that time frame. The pedigree studies do exactly that. We can't really change the rates because anytime we're changing them, we actually end up speeding it up. So think, for example, when a mutation flips over on itself, it doesn't get counted. It's like, oh man. So in reality, the rate's even faster. And yet what we're counting is still landing on 6,500 years. So imagine if we're not counting some of them because we're missing them because they're flipping over in the same spot. It's actually going to speed the rate up if we noticed it. So this is even worse. So what we do see makes things worse for them, not better. Things aren't slowing down. They're going quicker. So again, if all the experts are wrong, why are they wrong? How are they wrong? Mutation rates are another example of something that puts a time limit on the genome. Another thing that we noticed is that when we run a genealogical rate, not a pedigree rate, we find that the same thing happens. The most recent common ancestor of all living people lived just a few thousand years ago, and it doesn't place him in Africa, which is odd. But that's a numerical simulation. It's just run on math. It doesn't care about adding or trying to adjust anything. It's just using population genetics and genealogies. And it's saying, wow, humans only go back around 5,000 years ago. And that's kind of where they pop out of a random place. The genealogical paradox, due to population growth and interconnectedness, if you go back just a few thousand years, almost everyone alive today would share a common ancestor, meaning we all are relatively closely related within the last 5,000 years. Now, here's another thing. We get a population growth rate. We only need a population growth rate of 0.39% over 5,400 years to get to 8 billion people. That's very low and very easy to reconcile. Now, another thing. Here's the formation of most haplogroups. Here's where the population really exploded and diversed and filled up the world. Why didn't they do this in Africa? Why did they wait till they left Africa and got to exactly where the biblical scenario of the Tower of Babel is before they decided, you know what, let's spread it out around the world together at the same time? And when we look at a study on SNVs that determines when the rare coding events started to arise in human genomes, we noticed that about 5,115 years ago, the humans decided it's time to explode and go fill the earth. Exactly on the biblical timeline yet again. So
now, did that genealogical study, where did that have, it had people coming from that area?
no, that was even different. That's what's cool. Every one of these are independent discoveries in different fields. This is looking at SNVs, which are single nucleotide variances, and this is how we determine whether a haplogroup formed and where they formed from and diversified from. And the interesting part about that is when it tracks it backwards in time, that's the time lane they got. When we look at this is haplogroup formation that comes from the Y chromosome. And the Y chromosome is even more accurate because the mutation rate there is much faster. So we don't have to wait multiple generations to see one mutation. We can actually wait one generation and we can see 1 to 2 to 3. So it's much more accurate for tracing when this occurred and where it occurred. And when we do that, it lands exactly in the hotspot of the biblical Tower of Babel location. But here's something interesting as well. I should have thrown this in. I'm going to move this actually right now over here. So let's say that selection did happen. Okay, we're going to give a 15% selection into the D-loop region, and into the hypervariable regions. Okay, we're going to say that it was strong, even though it's not. Guess what? This slows the rate down from Eve being 6,500 years to 7,645 years ago, still in the biblical timeline. Kind of sucks to be an evolutionist, honestly. Like, they must see, they wouldn't care about this unless it landed on the biblical timeline. Because it does, they hate it. And the reason we know it hates is because we can read the old conversations back in the 90s that they had when this was discovered. The creationists got excited and the evolutionists got triggered. So it seems as though the same people, the same evil spirit is going on today with these crazy lunatics, and they call it science. But in reality, all they're doing is actually denying the empirical science to align with their mythological fairy tale that's actually pagan in origin and made up from a lie. And the critics attack the results of these pedigree mutation rates because they think we need to take evolutionary assumptions into account. But that's the entire question that we're trying to answer here. Take away the assumptions. What are the answers? What do we see? Can we explain the diversity of life based on this? We can. They cannot. Not without making up myths, not without stories. So this tells me that they trust radiometric dating from carbon dating, mostly from these dates, over observed germline mutation rates, which they can see with their own eyes, which they can test with their own eyes. They're going to trust methods that have been shown to be 50 to 60% wrong over a method that hasn't been seen to be wrong. That aligns with historical dates, that aligns with observed reactions. When we go and we look at whales in the past and we go, let's figure out how old whales are. Well, guess what? They've done that. And when we look down here at the pedigree rate, it aligns with the historical bottleneck of whaling that occurred when whales were almost eradicated, as opposed to the phylogenetic mutation rate here based on their assumption of fossils. And when they got dates on those based on radiometric dating. Again, completely wrong every single time. Then we go to horses. We go back.
Now, what are they doing with radiometric dating to get whale? Are they testing in between the fossil layers, or what are they doing?
Yeah, well, for humpback whales, they go to the oldest that they can find in the fossil record, and then they said, okay, this is when humpback whales arose. We don't find any examples of them living earlier than this, and this is that radiometric age that we get of their start date. So a phylogenetic rate should start with them, and then go until recently, and then align with the mutation rate. So then when we take that mutation rate and we align it, it shows that the most recent common ancestor of whales only goes back to the modern, when pirates were killing them off for their blubber and fat to make money, and we bottleneck them down to just a few of them, and it doesn't go back to the evolutionary timeline yet again. So that's one example. Another one would be horses. The thoroughbred horses, they were able to track through lineages and families, and they realized that early on they documented wrong dates, probably to sell horses for more money than they were worth, and they weren't pedigree horses at all. They were selling a different horses, and we wouldn't have known that without the DNA testing. And They go back as far as 1657 to a maternal lineage going on. So I like that one. We also have a really cool one with cats of the Pharaoh, because they went and they tested the mummified remains of cats that lived around 330 BC to about 663 BC. And then they said, well, how many mitotypes differences are there between these massive differences of cats that have been mummified? And they only found 3. Well, guess what? How long does it take to get 3 substitutions in a cat? They determined it. Well, they didn't even use a mutation rate. They just used mitotypes to determine the divergence rate based on the most recent common ancestor of all cats. And it was about 2,000 years prior to that. And then running the mutation rate agrees with that, and it lands on the first documented hieroglyphics of cats. Unbelievable.
Okay, wait, you got to slow this one down for me because I do not understand. Okay, so between modern cats and the Pharaoh's cat, there was only 3 substitutions?
Oh, okay. So sorry. What they did
Okay.
is they looked inside of a tomb of a pharaoh,
Yes.
and they found mummified cat remains. And they said
Right.
these cats seem to date around 3, let's just say
Right.
400 BC, somewhere around there. So 400 BC, these cats lived. They reconstructed their D loop. And they said, okay, inside here, there's 3 different mitotypes, 3 genomes that are probably 1 mutation apart from one another. So we're looking at 3 mutations. So then they go, how divergent would it be for these 3 mitotypes to have formed going backwards in time? And they said, probably around 2,000 years to a maximum of 7. And I said, let's test that with the mutation rate. So I said, okay, based on the mutation rate we have, because we have a pedigree from cheetahs, all we have to do is lower the generation time. We get it on domestic house cats. We get about 3 mutations in about 2,000 years. It literally lands perfectly in real life, in deep history, in deep pedigree, deep pedigree, thousands of years, lands exactly when it was supposed to.
And how many differences there and with modern cats? Did they look at that?
Yeah, no, I haven't, but it would be easy to do. And guess what?
Okay.
It's probably going to be around we're around the human era, because what happens is we find humans and animals have about the same amount of genetic diversity apart from most other creatures. They all came out of the bottleneck at the same time. And though the mutation rates may be a little bit different in some creatures, they all end up being about the same. And here's what I mean by that. An elephant might have a faster mutation rate than a cat, but a cat has more generations. So it equals the same after the certain amount of time. So if you go 10 generations, the cat and the elephant will have the same amount of mutations, even if one had a faster mutation rate, because it'll have a slower generation time. So they equal out after the amount of time. So give, say, 5,000 years, we should still be around all of the same time. That's the cool part about neutral regions. They make the best clock because there's no assumptions that need to get done. You can say, oh, if it's neutral everywhere. And we can look at it. We don't need to calibrate anything. We can look at it and it will give us exactly the answer. That's true. Now, it is true if we looked at the entire MtDNA, we've got to take into account there's going to be some selection. How much? Most of it's weeded out about the 6th generation anyway. So we don't even need to worry about the entire MtDNA anyway, because after you get about 6 to 10, especially 20 generations out, selection's already removed the most of the variants. So it's not even going to save them anyway, really. But I like the regions that are neutral. Our critics don't know this. They don't know anything about this. So that's why they're still arguing against selection. And that's why they still bring it up like it's some miraculous argument. That's what our debate opponents are going to say next week, because they're just going to hear it from somebody else. They're not going to know how to answer this. So I'm going to have to somehow teach them this in my opening whilst trying to give the evidence at the same time. It's going to be tough, but whatever. That's my problem.
And so with the cat and the elephant and the whale, so are they also testing that same region of the mitochondrial DNA?
Yes, they. I've shown everything that tests that. If we get into chickens, this was an entire MtDNA test. This looked at the entire mitochondria. They got still a rapid fast rate. By the way, guess what? The substitution rate for the avians rate based on the, this is a substantially higher rate based on the estimates of fossil calibration. So even in that region of the entire MtDNA, it was still faster going back 50 generations. Now remember, these people always say, once you start to go back a bunch of generations, selection will kick in and the time will get slower. The exact opposite happened in this study. So even when we look at the entire MtDNA, which incorporates the coding region, the protein coding region where selection is occurring, selection still wasn't enough to slow the rate down after 50 generations. And it was still 15 times higher than the pedigree mutation rate of the evolutionary timeline for when we know chickens arose based on fossils. So again, fossil record, let's test it. It's wrong. Now what? The observation must be wrong. What? What reality does that ever work in? Imagine if the roles were reversed. Imagine if we said, you know what, guys? You can't trust this. I know it's what we see and what we observe, and there's no real way to explain it away, but it's wrong.
They say you're a science denier. You're a science denier.
I'd be like, no. You guys got to take into account other things that we don't know of yet. What? Why? What does that even mean? It's like they want us to believe that something that died near a rock that's old must mean that organism is old. So therefore, if a fossil is mixed in with rocks, that means it must have occurred around the time when those rocks were laid down. That's the concept of why they believe that it's true. The geological layers must be accurate representations of time based on the radiometric time that those rocks give. They've never considered that if life still was young and there was a catastrophic event that occurred and pushed those bodies into those rock layers that now became fossilized, that they would give dates that are not right. And then when we test life and life shows that it's young, then clearly there must be something going on here that's not right. We have that answer. So if we test a fossil, we say to ourselves, well, we can't radiometrically date the fossil, but let's see what happens when we try. So we test it with radiocarbon dating and we go, wow, there's actual uncontaminated carbon-14 in there. That shouldn't be there even after 1 million years. There should be not a drop left, but it's there. That's a sign that it's probably young. Then we go, well, what else should we test inside of there? Well, look, there's soft tissue as well. Interesting. There's 18 types of soft tissue. It's ligaments, it's tendons, it's veins, it's cartilage, it's collagen, it's DNA. It's got everything. So you can't just say, well, it's old, but there's no evidence that it's young. It's like, no, there's still evidence that the fossil itself is young. And then there's also evidence that it's old based on the rocks that are around it. So what are you going to trust? The observational dates that come from direct evidence of pedigree mutation rates that show also by testing fossils that they also have elements in them that show that they're young? Or are you going to trust a single form of dating that has nothing to do with it at all, which is radiometric dating in different ways and shapes and form that says it's old based on where they're finding it in a rock layer? Because every test to determine whether or not those dates are correct by looking at mutation rates have shown that they're completely wrong. And since they can't figure out how the mutation rates are wrong, as you've seen before, they've tried selection. They admit it doesn't work. They've tried bottlenecks. That doesn't work. They've tried to invoke, what was another one? There really isn't anymore. They've literally admitted that the selection is neutral. They've admitted that it's the phylogenetic rate that's the assumption estimate biased one. They don't know how to slow it down. They've admitted that there's kudos in getting older dates. They've admitted that after a couple generations, there's not somatic yet being counted anymore. I mean, that should be obvious. So these arguments, no, we're not forgetting about selection.
Now, this brings up a question for me because now you showed Parsons and Ann Gibbs, I think was her name, and other people who are probably, I don't know about Parsons, but I'm sure he probably believes in evolution.
Yes.
Because a lot of people do. But how do they feel about those mutation rates? Like, what is their answer? Like, do they, I know that Ann Gibbs, you put up the quote where she's like, hey, it's a problem for the timeline.
Yeah.
But Does this problem bother them? Does the discrepancy bother them? Do you know?
Yes, it does. Okay. Even according to the most recent common ancestor of mtDNA may be younger than the most recent common ancestor of modern humans, it remains implausible to explain the known demographic distribution of mtDNA variation by human migration that occurred in only the last 6,500 years. So look at what he said before that, though. Clearly incompatible with the known age of modern humans. So he said 6,500 years. This is clearly incompatible with what we know about human evolution. Humans are not 6,500 years old. And then it remains implausible to explain how humans diversified and distributed based on that timeline. We have no answer. It remains implausible. And it is true. I ran the numbers, and I'm going to show you right now. Anybody can do this too, by the way. This is really, really easy to do. And I've favored evolution yet again. So if we have a population, I said, what was the population 4,000 BC? It said 60 to 70 million people. That was huge. But I also found a contradictory one. It said approximately 14 million people lived on Earth 6,000 years ago. This is based on historical population data compiled by the organization like the Population Reference Bureau. I said, okay, let's just go with the low one. Who cares? Now, imagine a world of 6,000 people, 2,000 or 200 generations in the future, with the total population starting out today of 14 million people. 7 million of them would be females. The people live on isolated demographic regions like islands and continents, with very limited gene flow between the groups and zero migration from certain places like Australia. We want to access the probability of only one of the 7 million distinct maternal lineages alive today that survived to that time. In other words, would a single present-day woman become the sole mitochondrial most recent common ancestor to everyone in 6,000 years forward from now? This would mean that all other current female lineages went extinct, leaving one. Conclusion, virtually zero in probability. Conclusion, why? The quantitative terms, the probability is so vanishingly small that for practical purposes, it should be considered zero, absent of some unforeseen catastrophe or selection pressure. There it is again. So what's going on? They need a global bottleneck on the biblical timeline to account for this. There isn't one. The only one that's the closest is the Catawba catastrophe 75,000 years ago, give or take. Okay, that's the best they've got. They don't have any mutation rate going back to then. So again, zero. I even stated 6,000 years ago, Australian Aborigines were isolated in Australia. What bottleneck them? So even according to AI, only possible scenario that could allow the most recent common ancestor years ago would be a bottleneck. What bottleneck occurred? We have no idea. There isn't one. Look, check this one out. Population paradox. 150,000 years ago, the population growth rate had hovered at zero. So there was no population growth. Every child born, one died. And it was just moving sideways. Yet, when we study contemporary populations, our best analogs to the past, they demonstrate positive growth. That's right. Even hunter-gatherers have a massive population growth of like 3.4. So how do they get around this? They said this is true even for populations drawn after the dawn of agriculture some 10,000 years ago. It has long been a paradox with no solution. They admit it is thought we split from a common ancestor. There's more than enough time for the diversity. Where is it? Why are we only 14 nucleotide differences? Are you kidding me? 14, we can count one arising every 30 generations. How long does it take to get 14? It doesn't take 7 million years. So they need a population bottleneck. They have to have it. See?
And where are all the people? This is one of the things that is really interesting when you look up the evolutionary timeline and stuff, and you try to find out, what was the population growth rate would have to be to arrive at present day. For evolutionary timeline, it's like 0.00000. It's like so many zeros. It's like, wait a minute, something doesn't make sense here with the population growth rate, right? So
no, it doesn't. And that's what I go to. So I don't just use that, right? You've seen my stuff before. I go, when was astronomy? When did that start to get popular? When was the first time humans had astronomy? About 5,000 years ago. How about mathematics worldwide? 5,000 years ago. How about metallurgy? They tracked metallurgy to the first copper extraction of around 5,000 years ago. How about the brewing of beer? People love alcohol. Oh, about 5,000 years ago. How about irrigation? Well, that first irrigation ditches ever grown were about 5,000 years ago. How about when they first writing system? Oh, look at that, about 5,000 years ago. You know, how about the oldest leather shoes that they've ever documented? Oh, about 5,000 years ago. Our old leather, that's tanning tools. Oldest leather shoes, same thing, same area. Oh, what a surprise. You know, so humans walked around barefoot for about 200 to 300,000 years ago until they left Africa, decided to walk over a desert, by the way. Great idea to do without shoes. And then what did they do when they got to the Fertile Crescent where it was the best ever? Let's make shoes. Stupid. Gigantic megalithic structures 4,500 years ago, about 1,000 years after the flood, when there was a population big enough to actually do it. We don't have to change time frames or anything. When there was this
Now, let me ask you this though, because if you look up right now, I was just watching something about a structure in Iran that they're saying is 10,000 years old. So there's like other things that they say are older. So
Right.
what would be your response to that?
Gobekli Tepe is one of them. Gobekli Tepe, they said, was buried about 10,000 to 13,000 years ago. It's based on radiometric dating of a plant that they found nearby, even though plants are extremely rare because they can't date the monument itself because it was buried about shortly after it was constructed. Then they said it was about 1,000 years after it was constructed. And the reason I can throw that out the window is simply because of one of the pillars that they found. The pillar has on it something that's very unique and something that if you're into ancient aliens and the history of things that they find around the world, there's a very indicative thing that somebody holds all the time, and it's called a handbag. And if you type in handbag, you see this weird artistic design that's in art, and sometimes they're holding it, and it's a bag, and nobody knows what it is. It looks like they're carrying a modern day purse. But they have it. They have it in New Mexico. They have it in Iran. They have it in Iraq. They have it in Africa. They have it everywhere. It's a very weird handbag. The same design is on the Sumerian thing, or it's Gobekli Tepe, dated 4,000 years older than the next artistic thing. So you mean to tell me an artist that wherever this idea came from, we're going to say it is obviously a Babylonian symbol that they took with them as they migrated around, because they brought the same mathematics with them. They obviously brought the same artistic style. They had an art form. They drew some handbags and then they buried it, and it was never seen for 4,000 years. Then a human civilization started to branch up and started drawing the same thing again, and then diverged and brought the art with them and started drawing it everywhere. How did it vanish for 4,000 years and then somebody brought back the exact same handbag? Obviously, it was created in the same era because it's the same art depicted on the same thing. And what sense does it also make that they decided to build a megalithic structure not far away, because this is in northern Turkey, and build this megalithic structure and then not do anything for 4,000 to 5,000 years? And then all of a sudden decide, let's do it again everywhere at the same time. That makes total sense. See what I mean? It's just lunacy to be like, wait, so we had the capacity to do it. Then we stopped doing it. And then we all started doing it again at the same time everywhere else. So just use logic. I don't need radiometric dating to tell me that is not so illogical. It's absolutely absurd. So I don't trust the radiometric dates from carbon dating for that tower, simply because, as admitted by scientists themselves, if there was a global catastrophic event such as worldwide volcanism, you could never trust the ages of anything around that event or older, because the carbon pumped out would be dead carbon from volcanoes. So it would date exponentially older. And what does the flood say? It was a global catastrophic event that created massive volcanism worldwide and created an ice age that lasted from 800 to 1,500 years. Very simple. Our model answers everything so good. And it's parsimonious evidence too. And they don't know how to get over this. This is the greatest riddle in human history. They even admit this. Like, wait a minute. Why did humans do no documentation, no math, no irrigation, no population growth, no religions, no sophisticated symbolism, no historical evidence at all? And then dramatically, out of nowhere, the greatest human riddle in human history, everything exploded at the same time in the exact same place where we said it happened, at the same time we said it happened, and then branched out into all people groups around the world, bringing the knowledge with them everywhere. I mean, why does it have to land on our story? The story could have been anything. The story could have landed at any timeline. The mutation rates could have landed on 17,000 years ago. All of this could have landed on 17,000 years ago, and we would have no model at all. Instead, it's literally confirming what the Bible says. So, of course, the model is true. None of this has to land on it at all, but it always does. The only discrepancy is radiometric dating from old dates from rocks. That's it. That's the whole thing that throws a wrench in the average mindset. And we have different answers for that. Walt Brown said it was the radioactive elements were created and looked very old, and they were created during the flood from a piezoelectric effect. Answers in Genesis has catastrophic plate tectonics, which says accelerated nuclear decay happened over 1.5 billion years during the flood, and that made everything look exponentially older than it actually was. Then we have things like the Proton 21 laboratories, which shows that when they're created, they're already looking old when they are created. Then we can just say that old Earth creationists are probably right, and the Earth is old, but all life is exactly young, like the Bible describes in the 6 days of creation, and everything except for the Earth and the stars were created old. Guess what? You still can't get away from the young Earth creation timeline of biology and genetics and all life. And in those 6 days, God created animals and humans. And since that time, there was a global flood a little over 5,000 years ago, and the evidence lands on it. I mean, it's so simple. I mean, they want to convolute it, but it's so simple. And it's parsimonious, Rainey. We get it like Occam's razor. Why convolute something? Why make it more complicated than it has to be? Why jump in all these weird rescue devices when you don't need to? They need to, because theirs doesn't agree with the observable evidence. See the problem? That's their problem. It's not ours. They're the deniers. We're not. So I guess that's it.
Awesome.
We're going to jump over then into genetic boundaries. We're going to start from the very beginning.
Okay.
Genetic boundaries are an interesting thing because evolution expected convergence going backwards in time into common ancestry, meaning going back in time, everything would converge onto its common ancestor. So a human would converge with some Sahelanthropus sagensis, where it diverged at the time from chimp. A bear and a dog would diverge from the bear dog. A cat species would diverge from a myacid. These examples should be everywhere. But in 2018, there was a sweeping gene study that revealed new facts about evolution. It said after analyzing the barcodes, which is in the mitochondria, again, in a particular region called the CO1 gene, stands for cytochrome C oxidase 5. And what they found is the researchers noticed that there was a telltale sign that almost all animals emerged at about the same time. And I don't know why they put almost all. I'm guessing that there was probably some splits that occurred later, more recently, but nothing goes past this. It's like almost like everything is like right around this time frame when they look at this bottleneck area. See, when they looked at birds and fish and moths, they noticed there's very little diversity, which means that there was a global bottleneck because they all went through it at the same time to have this same amount of diversity. Because remember, diversity is increasing at the same time frame. As a matter of fact, it's a paradox. Genetic diversity across different species varies much less than expected. Remember, if hundreds of millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years were occurring from a bottleneck, that means some species that have a faster mutation rate would eventually branch off and be much deeper lineage and have much more diversity than a newer species that had formed recently. But we don't see that. This is a paradox. All the species exhibit from different population sizes, by the way. Remember, different population sizes should also change the diversity, because the bigger a population gets, the stronger natural selection works, and the weaker genetic drift works. When you get to smaller populations, genetic drift works better, but selection doesn't work as good. So you're going to get differences when populations stay small, and others like birds grow like crazy, or like fish grow into billions of populations, but yet diversity is still the same and it's very low. That can only happen if it was recent. So what they did is they created these barcodes and they look like this. There's differences between different species, especially the more diverged they get, they look completely different. And this caused them to say, well, although it's easy to imagine humans passed through a bottleneck 170,000 years ago, it's hard to believe that the exact same thing happened in all species. Did herrings, which are a fish, really pass through an equally recent population bottleneck, and anchovies too? Like, what in the world could kill fish in a lake, sharks in an ocean, birds on a mountain, and humans in cities? What could do that? They don't know. They have no clue. I said, does that sound familiar to anybody? Because it sure sounds familiar to me. They said, well, there's nothing out of the ordinary that happened in Africa. Well, that throws a wrench in their model. And what I showed you earlier, there's no trace in the geologic record for any of this. Young Earth creationists noticed this, and every organization talked about it. I found every article from every major organization, AIG, CMI, they all published about this article. So I decided this article is clearly important. So I did a deep dive on it, and I've gone deeper than all of these people have. And
okay, wait, can I ask you though, why did they say that there was a bottleneck 170,000 or 200 years ago? Like, well, based on the mutation rates, we wouldn't go back, the bottleneck wouldn't go back that far. So where are they getting this 200,000 year bottleneck?
They had to have one because they discovered that genetic diversity was low. So they invented one. They didn't have any evidence. That's why when they look for it, they don't find anything, but they need to have a global bottleneck. So they don't have any,
there's no particular reason for that number. Like, where are they getting that number? Like,
it changes all the time.
Diversity? Okay.
Nah, that number changes. They don't have, they like that number because that's the origin of humans, right? That was at the time, that was the first Homo sapien phenotypic arrival of Homo sapiens. So they said that must have been it. That's when primitive man went in and we came out. So they said that must have been when it was. So that's where it comes from. It comes from human studies of testing fossils and phenotypic diversity and changes, because they said, well, if humans came out of something, that must mean there was something drastic that changed, maybe a climate shift that would make modern day humans pop out of nowhere during that time frame. So therefore, there must have been a catastrophic event that did it. See what they need? So that's why.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So then once Young Earth creationists noticed this study, they were like, oh my gosh, this is literally describing Noah's flood. This is amazing. All animals arriving at the same time as humans out of a bottleneck. That's like literally the description of Noah's flood. So the study came out and they wrote a disclaimer. I've never heard of this before. They came out and they wrote, this study is grounded strongly in support of Darwinian evolution. The very thing that they always claim isn't real. Yeah, well, they're claiming it now, including the understanding that all life has evolved from a common biological origin several billion years ago. Our work follows the mainstream view of human evolution. We do not propose a single Adam or Eve. We do not propose any catastrophic event. What do you mean you don't propose a catastrophic event? Of course you do. You just said all life arose out of a bottleneck. Where did it come from? Why are you looking in the geologic record for a catastrophic event if you don't think one happened? Of course you think one happened.
Okay, so you're saying they wrote this article and then they started realizing, oh, wait, this helps the biblical timeline and the Young Earth creationists are using this. We need to put a disclaimer and say, look, we're not proposing that.
Yeah. No, that's not what we're saying.
But that's not us.
Yeah. Don't lose our grant money, you creationist. We hate you. We hate you. You're going to make us lose all of our money because look, the secular papers were admitting this debunks much about what we know today about the evolution of species. They in a interview that the scientist himself, Thaler, said, another unexpected finding was in the study was species had clear genetic boundaries and nothing much in between. The absence of in-between species is something that perplexed Darwin. Clearly, there should be a linear progression from species slowly and gradually over time, but they didn't. He said, this conclusion was very surprising and I fought against it as hard as I could. What are you fighting against? I thought you just said that this study supports Darwinian evolution and that it's grounded in evolution going back to biological life. Why do you have to fight something that you clearly said isn't a problem? How come the secular community is admitting this debunks much about what we know about the evolution of species? I mean, literally supports Darwinian evolution. You got to be kidding me. I love it. What they found was clear lines that chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, humans, there was no convergence going back in time. There was independent lines of ancestry. And here's the cool part. When you test humans, the consensus sequence that modern humans have today, when you erase the mutations, the most that there are is only 10 of them in this region, by the way. When you take it back to 0, which the vast majority of people have because the CO1 gene is highly conserved, you land on a consensus sequence that all of Neanderthal, Denisovan, and Heidelbergensis came from. Not to, from. That means they had to exist on this side of the bottleneck. They could not have come before it. So I did a whole study on that as well. That's also published, showing that if we test Heidelbergensis, how much different are they from a chimpanzee? Because they lived much closer to that chimpanzee ancestor. So
and when do
clearly
they say Heidelbergensis?
Heidelbergensis?
Yes. When do they say that was
They
before? Yeah.
arose around 800,000 years ago.
Okay. But
And
now with the genetic data, because they found genetic data,
right,
they know that actually no, they had to have lived much closer or at the same time with Homo sapiens.
They're keeping the timeline the same. They're not changing that.
Okay.
I'm taking the timeline and changing it based on the observable mutation rates. But the problem is I can't do that with them because we don't have genealogies to make a mutation rate. So that's the problem with them. But we say they're just human anyway. So it's not really going to be that much different. The problem that Neanderthal ran into is their small population sizes. They lived in a population between 15 and 20 maximum, including children. And then they lived in these small populations. So anytime that it would start to get like a little bit higher, a pair would just take up and leave. You know, kids, I'm tired of this life. This life sucks. I'm not killing mammoth anymore. They left. They started their own tribe. And then another one would pop up. And then another one would pop up, and then another one. But they stayed in these little tiny populations everywhere, which has massive amounts of gene flow, very low selection. The mutations are being traded because they're giving one woman daughter to another tribe. So its gene flow is moving from one to the next. So mutations are swapping, and you're basically they live for about 1,000 to 1,500 years. And that's something else that we know that they did because a lot of people say, well, we know that they lived that long ago because of radiometric dating, right? It always goes back to that with them. But guess what? There's a study that shows that this is wrong. The Young Earth creationists picked up on this as well. It's called the Neanderthal extinction dilemma. The findings show that small Neanderthal populations would have caused them to become extinct in just 10,000 years. This is published in the literature, by the way, the peer-reviewed literature. This shows you right here the populations that they lived in, 10 to 15, including children. And then I found one down here that said 20. So by using those numbers and by putting it into this study right here called Inbreeding Allele Effects of Stochasticity might be sufficient to account for the Neanderthal extinction. If they lived in 10 to 15, that means they would have gone extinct in about 500 years. If they lived in a group of 25 to 50, they would have gone extinct in 500 to 1,000 years. So how in the world could they have survived for 400,000 years? It makes no sense. They could not have possibly done it. So inbreeding and extinction, yet another example that puts a limit on the genome. Again, the discrepancy between the fossil record, again, genetic evidence has never been solved by the experts. And then this is for my debate. I'd like to see our debate opponents try. They'll sure try. They sure deny it. They sure, anything that goes against it, even if their own scientists publish it, it's got to be wrong. It's got to be wrong. Even though I use their own evidence against them, I'm still wrong. So anyway, so humans, Neanderthal, Denisovan, Erectus, we diverge and go back to a consensus sequence. That would be impossible going the opposite direction. If they live before us, there's no way that they're going to have the same one. But we find the same thing with wolves and dogs. We get modern day dogs that converge going back to a single consensus sequence from a wolf. And this is also in the published literature outside of that. And
And
then
what would be the timeline of that?
Well, we are going to go to a published study based on the de novo mutation rates of dogs, and we will find that the timeline for dogs showed that domestication for most dog breeds began about 2000 or 1500 to 2000 years ago. I didn't look up the dog breeds. I just grabbed the sequences and then ran the numbers. I should have looked, actually, now that you mentioned that. I have no idea what the dog breeds are, but somebody else can do that, because critics are going to go through my paper to peer review it more than any peer-reviewed scientific journal ever would, because they're looking for any hole they can find. So go ahead. That'll be a challenge to anybody watching this. Feel free to try figure out whatever species dogs are in that little, like paragraph that I have on the dog mutation rate, because it only goes back to a most recent common ancestor, because it didn't include wolves. They separated wolves and they separated dogs out, but the dog had the deeper rooted pedigree and 14 different breeds. So I went with the dog. Why include the wolf? But this study, I was able to take the nucleotide sequences and to see if there was a convergence consensus sequence going backwards in time, and there was. So that means they all diverged from a wolf, but the fox did not agree. The fox had their own. So the fox and the dog actually do not converge on one another at all, just like humans and chimpanzees did not. That's why that study said humans, including all animal species, came out together out of a bottleneck. That's what this is talking about, and that's what that represents. That's why they have their own consensus sequence that they diverge into going backwards in time. And that shows that there was a bottleneck, because it's the only way to explain that kind of diversity arising afterwards. Oh yeah, there's that study, by the way. We provided several lines of evidence supporting a single origin for dogs and disfavoring alternative models in which dog lineages arises separately from a distinct wolf populations. And that's in the secular literature. They're admitting that. So, oh yeah, there's Neanderthal right there. Look at that. Only 6 nucleotide differences. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 differences between us and Neanderthal. Modern day humans have 10 differences. So when they say, Neanderthal could have never gotten 6 differences, it's like, what are you talking about? Of course they could have. So easy to explain that amount of diversity. Look at the diversity in big cats. 58 nucleotides, 45 different, 73. So low. So low.
Okay, so then that Thaler paper that you were showing where he was fighting it as hard as he could. So
Yeah.
what he's fighting is that he said this cannot, it doesn't really fit with our ideas about origins, because we would have some animals that diverged a long time ago, maybe in the millions of years, and we'd have these long lineages going back and lots of mutations between, but instead we have these separate ones with not that many mutations between.
Right.
Am I getting that right?
Exactly. They've noticed that there's low genetic diversity between all life, and all life started out of a bottleneck, because there's independent lines of ancestry that go back and don't converge on a consensus sequence. So when they started DNA barcoding humans, they would go to get the blood sample, and they would scan the blood sample, and they'd go, okay, we have a sequence. Now, the CO1 gene is only about 650 base pairs, so it's really cheap and it's easy to sequence. So they started cataloging all birds, all bees, all fruit flies, you name it. They're cataloging everywhere, worldwide. It's super cheap. And then they got this huge bank database, and they said, let's test it. Let's see what we can get from all the data. They finally did in 2018, and they said, oh my gosh, the diversity is like the same between everything. And there's independent lines of ancestry going back with no convergence. They're like, what could do this? And they said, the only thing that could do this would be a bottleneck, which they're denying now, of course. But it's the only way you can reset genetic diversity. There's no other way to do it. So they don't know. They speculate in the things what could do it. It's funny watching them try to talk about. Maybe it's random. I even heard Erica say that one time. Maybe it's random. It just resets itself every 200,000 years. Wait a minute. If this gets even worse, because let's say, for example, there's a genetic reset every 200,000 years. This is so devastating, and I'm going to show you why. This is like the worst case scenario for them. They don't even realize what they did by saying it. So if we go backwards in time and we see that after this bottleneck, let's just say it was 200,000 years ago. Let's give them this stupid date. Okay, after 200,000 years, we've amassed 65 differences between chimpanzees and humans. Chimpanzees have about 65 differences away from us on average. So that means humans have accumulated about 10. So we're going to go over here and we're going to say, okay, after the bottleneck, let's say it was an ice age or a global flood, doesn't really matter, that we have 200,000 years and we have 10 and 5. Okay, now we're going to go 10 and 5, another 200,000 years. Oh,
Wait,
10 and
hold
5.
on. Let me slow you down so I can make sure I'm understanding.
Sure.
Okay. So between humans, there's 10. Between humans, you might have 10 differences.
Yes.
Between chimpanzees, you would have, okay, between chimpanzees and humans, you would have 65 differences.
Right.
Okay.
Between chimps are around 65, but within them, there's only about 5 to 10. Very low as well, similar to humans. Like I said, the diversity in between a species is very similar, but the differences over time usually work out to be the same.
But you've got the 65 on here because we're trying to give the evolutionary timeline and get humans and chimps to emerge from a common ancestor.
Right. Okay. So remember, we are similar to them by 65 differences. Once you erase those 65
just on that one thing, just to make it clear, just on the on that one region.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So we are about 65 differences until you get to a consensus sequence. By the time you get to that, we're about 24 differences. That's it. 24. That's the line. But on average, we are about 65. So we're just going to use like the 10 in human and the 65, and we're going to go backwards in time. So if we're only 65 differences on average right now, wait a minute, where's the 7 million years of genetic diversity that should be there between us and them? We should have about 2,450 differences. That means that almost none of that CO1 gene would look anything like what is there. Instead, we're about what? 98.5% similar, right? We're very high genetic similarity, but that similarity mostly arose after the bottleneck. That means that all of these 7 million years are missing in genetic diversity, because once you get before the bottleneck, there is so few differences separating us that you don't get millions of years. You don't even get hundreds of thousands of years. So how could you possibly get millions? It's impossible. See the problem that they have?
Okay, now what if they say, well, it was just really slow changing, and like, what does the bottleneck do in this situation? Because
all the bottleneck,
but you could say, well, those 65 differences happened over the 6 million years.
Well, they can't, because the genetic bottleneck would have reset it again. So we're getting a reset every time there is one. So every time there's a reset, the mitochondria now will tell us how many differences are arising from that bottleneck. So when we look at chimps and we go, oh, there's 65, and we look at humans and then, oh, there's about 10. Those can have only arisen from that bottleneck, because we can't go before that to see what were mutations, what were not. So if we go backwards in time and there's only a few differences separating us, how long did that actually take? We're going to say it took about 2,000 years, right? Not long. They have to say it took millions. Where's their evidence? It's missing. Even when Dan and Dapper Dino and Grayson were live and they were critiquing the video on one of my channels called Evolutionary Destroyed or whatever, and they didn't play the video first, so they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. They played it and they listened to it and they just went, yeah. Dan goes, that's a really good point. That was it. Then they moved on and just trash talked me, right? That was it. I went, boom, another great argument right in the bag. They can't do it. See the problem? You cannot have 7 million years and not have both mutation saturation, and you surely would not have as much genetic similarity. Both of those facts destroy deep time and put a shelf life on the genomes. That's it. Remember, the mitochondria builds up in mutations, and they happen in different regions. In the CO1 region, they don't just turn over in a hot spot. They turn over anywhere at any time. But selection can remove some of them. But that's okay. Removing random mutations isn't going to randomly keep your sequence the same. If monkeys are randomly mutating and chimps are randomly mutating and humans are randomly mutating over 7 million years, you're still going to get massive amounts of diversity. You would need a hot spot where only a couple base pairs are flipping, and you could say, okay, well, now I know why it's similar. 99.9% of it doesn't change, and the ones that do just keep flipping over on each other. But that's not the case for the CO1 gene. Uh-oh. So this is the reality right here. And when you take these back, what each of these are, these are scores that I ran to determine how close each of these are. These are Heidelbergensis, Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, and Denisovan. And I ran a comparison to a chimpanzee. And I compared the same chimpanzee to every single one of these. So human, how different are we? We're 97.23%. So that means we should be the most different because we're at the end of the line of evolution where the most mutations have occurred. But yet, when we test Heidelbergensis, look at that. They're 96.64. And when we test Denisovan, they're 97. What? When we test Neanderthal, they're 98. Why? It's all over the place, and they're almost identical. Why? Why are we all the same? Because we came out of the bottleneck and mutated away from it at the same time. They're not in a linear pattern. That's why we don't see a linear pattern. The linear pattern doesn't exist. See? Compared to a chimpanzee, right? These are all differences between ourselves. Look at the differences between the chimp. The human is right here. 89.76. Okay? 89. Heidelbergensis is 88% different. They're less different than we are. We're more similar to a chimp than our ancestors. That's the opposite of what needs to happen unless they came out of a bottleneck and got more mutations and then went extinct. That's exactly what we see. We see the same thing with Neanderthal, 90% similarity, 89, 89. We're right here. I don't know why I put us in the middle. That kind of messes things up. But look at that. Neanderthal are more similar to chimps than we are. What? Why? It makes no sense. None of it makes any sense unless you look at it from a biblical perspective and say, we came off the ark, we mutated, we branched off, certain lineages died, we survived, and that's the pattern. And we could explain it. Evolution is like this. So here's Heidelbergensis, right? Where is he at? He's 88% similar. And then we get up here, and they're 90% similar. So they somehow got more similar to this guy over here at the end. And then this guy became less similar. And then us, we're way over here. We became more similar than this guy. So we're getting more similar to chimps as time goes on. We're supposed to be getting less similar. That's not how this works. Why are we becoming more similar to chimps? We're supposed to be diverging from them. Our ancestors have more similarities to them. This doesn't make sense. It's stupid. Am I the only one that sees this? I love running these numbers. It's everything is a new epiphany. Everything refutes evolution. Every time I run something, I'm like, what? Why aren't creationists discovering these things more? Am I the only one crunching these numbers? I mean, when I found out that study happened, I was shocked. And I read through the other young earth creationist journals and articles, and I was like, wait, what? Like, why aren't they going more in depth on this? CMI finally messaged me and said, where did you get that information from? I said, same place as you guys got it. You wrote an article on it. What are you talking about? You wrote an article on it like years ago. They totally didn't even know. So I don't know. I just like certain arguments more than others. And I'm a huge fan of genetics, and genetics completely destroys evolution.
Okay, Matt. So you talked a lot about how the mutation rates actually show that humans, animals, that there's not that much diversity, and they go back to common ancestors, separate common ancestors, just a few thousand years ago. But like there's a lot of studies that people put forward where they try to show that there's actually, go all these canids that go back to a common ancestor, millions of years ago. And one of the studies that was recently brought to my attention was this determinants of de novo mutations in extended pedigrees of 43 dog breeds. So what do you think about studies like that?
Anytime you see an evolutionary date, remember what they said. They said it themselves, demand uncertainty. Now, why would they get such an old date? It's definitely not coming from mitochondria. So where is it coming from? Most of the time, you're going to find a very similar thing. They're not testing the good areas. They're testing the nuclear genome, and they're assuming a lot. And the nuclear genome is a horrible test, is a horrible place to test. And the main reason why is because imagine testing your muscle. Your muscle repairs itself, right? It seems like a pretty bad area of your body to test to determine how old you are, because your muscle repairs itself. So why would I test that? The nuclear genome undergoes recombination. Recombination is one hell of a repair organism. So why would you test an area going through massive amounts of repair where there's massive amounts of selection, massive amounts of recombination, when we know we can go to a region where none of that's occurring and gives you an accurate clock and it's neutral? When you do that, you get young dates. When you do bad studies, you get bad results, but they need something to align with their mythical time period. So they look to the nuclear genome. The nuclear genome, as anybody knows that knows our model, knows that was created. That's why the regions that are sequenced are functional. And that's why when you mutate them, harmful things happen. So we don't look to the nuclear genome as being evidence for ancestry. We say this is common region of common design, and that the differences are built in functional design. That's our model. And so when you're trying to get a rate from it, you're not going to get anything accurate, even if you wanted to, because it's repairing itself. It's always going to look older because it's constantly trying to repair, and the genes that are the mutations that are rising, some are being removed, some are being left. So there's a lot of assumptions going on those rates. All right. So to conclude this madness, we're going to be talking about something that I like to ask pretty much anybody that questions creation, and that's for evolution. If I were to tell you that the theory that you believe started as a lie and was pushed with an agenda, would you still believe it, and why? Like, what would be the point of that? So today I'm going to show you that everything that you believe was actually ripped from creationists and retrofitted into the evolutionary theory and pushed as an agenda, all from a lie. So we're going to start out with the creationist, Carl Linnaeus. He was one that introduced the nested hierarchical pattern of biological classification. Linnaeus originally intended it as a way to organize God's created kind, but later Darwin reinterpreted it as a reflecting common ancestry. So what he did is he set up these boundaries that were set up with categorizing every different kind. And when he did this, something became known as the taxonomic boundary paradox that shouldn't exist in evolutionary theory because there are no boundaries, but there is. And that is our step one into this. Because Carl Linnaeus developed a classification system in the 18th century using this hierarchical rank patterns, he placed humans next to primates, not because of any evolutionary relationship, but based on some anatomical similarities. And there were 5 of them in particular. That was it. So when people today say we are apes, all they're doing is giving you the classification system of somebody that didn't even believe it. He had to classify us somewhere. Did you know we were next to anteaters for a long time until they discovered an ape? So we're anteaters too. So, and then we have Professor Sir Richard Owens. He's the father of homology and the archetype theory, which was the natural pattern of unifying design of creatures over time. And what he did is he said in Genesis 1, we read that sea creatures and birds were created first, and then land animals after that. So he created a pattern after the archetype that all future creatures would be based off of, and then God would use that plan, culminating up until the humans, which was the pinnacle of God's design and creation. He called it structuralism, and you can see it in his book, how he said and used it as a design pattern that God based everything off of. So he even said that ideal, original, or fundamental pattern in which a natural group of animals or systems of organs had been constructed, and modifications of which the various of such animals or organs need be referred. So he created the the taxonomical version of the hierarchy in homology. So now we have it in two different forms. And by the way, they actually ended up finding that weird type creature that he was talking about in the fossil record. But then we get into the genetic evidence, which is creation versus evolution. You see, what happened is when in genetics, they believed in such deep time that the Ernest Mayr, he predicted a lot of different things, by the way. He said the search for homologous genes is futile, except for in very close relatives. What does he mean by that? Well, homologous genes would be like Hox genes or the PAX6 genes, which create the eyes. Any genes that would be considered homologous among distantly related species. Like there's no way we would share a gene that an octopus has. We are so separated. Mutations would have scrambled it into oblivion. His exact prediction was that much of what has been learned about gene physiology makes it evident that the search for homologous genes, similar codes due to common ancestry, is quite futile except in very close relatives. If there is if there is only one efficient solution for a certain functional demand, every different gene complexes will come up with the same solution, no matter how different the pathway by which it is achieved. The saying, many roads leads to Rome, is as true in evolution as in daily affairs. Then in 1975, we got the exact opposite prediction by young Earth creationist Henry Morse. He said, in the creation model, the same similarities are predicted and basis on the similar purpose design. So notice similarities have to do with functional design, not random chance from random mutations. His exact wording was the creative process would have designed similar structures for similar functions and different structures for different functions. In the creation model, the same similarities are predicted on the basis of a common purpose designer. It may yet be determined that all living organisms exhibit similar underlying DNA level properties reflecting a unified pattern of functional design. Such findings would be consistent with the hypothesis of a common designer and suggest that relatively little time has elapsed since creation. What?
Wow.
We literally got the prediction in taxonomy, homology, and genetics. Every prediction that evolution now uses as evidence for itself, we got first.
And that's interesting because this is one of the things that is often said, well, why would, we're so genetically similar. That's the evidence for evolution. But,
yeah, stolen,
so
plagiarized. It was never their evidence. They've predicted the opposite. Because if you're not going to say that there's similar homologous genes, you're definitely not going to say that there's similar non-coding genes, because they would be the first to disappear. The homologous genes would be the last to leave because they would be the most conserved. So they predicted the exact opposite. We not only found that there was high genetic similarity, we not only found that there was similarity based on function, by the way, because look, now they admit, oh, this sequences have to do with function. You say it everywhere, taking them as structures. Look at this. Find the most similar sequences with known functional annotations and transfer their annotations. It's like they can now look at this one. How to predict protein function from sequences. The prediction we made. It's like we predicted that these would be functionally similar based on their functions. We were correct. So now they flipped it and they said, no, that's evidence for us. No, it wasn't. It never was. You predicted the exact opposite. This was found in 1978, 2 years after Henry Morse made the prediction, and like 10 years later for Ernest Mayr, he discovered that the Hox gene were in fruit flies. And he said, this is highly conserved. And they said, no biologist had even the foggiest notion of such similarities could exist between genes of such different animals. It was inescapable and stunning. So another shock to evolution, another retrofitting contradiction that they've wiggled into the theory when they were completely wrong. Another example of an unfalsifiable theory. And yet we got it right. yet again. So the only reason there is similarity at all is because of functional differences, which we young Earth creationists predicted. And the only reason there is any pattern at all is because of the multi-layered, multi-functioning genomes. So Nathaniel Jensen predicted multifunctional layered genomes way before 2015. Actually, I got to remake this one. I found it in 2013 in one of his papers. So throw that in the trash. Anyway, we've got creationists predicted nested hierarchical patterns in taxonomy, homology, and DNA. This is not evidence for evolution. It is a plagiarization and retrodiction. And Francis Collins from the Human Genome Project said, the evidence alone of genetic similarities between humans and chimps, say, does not, of course, prove common ancestry. From a creationist perspective, such similarities could simply demonstrate that God used successful design principles over and over again. So this nonsense, come on, get out of here. Here's where the lie comes in. So anyway, Lamarck was somebody that was a naturalist, and he believed in deep time evolution, hardcore. He wanted it to be true above anything else. And he wanted it for another reason. And Charles Lyell took his work and he loved it. He says, I devoured Lamarck. His theories delighted me. His argument, if pushed as far as it must go, would prove that man may have come from the orangutan. So that was and instantly became like his main push and his main goal. And since Darwin brought one of his books with him, that influenced him the most. And the crazy part about that is, like today, even today, his work is what people fall back on to as evidence. Is shocking. It all started literally from a lie. Like like it's just known. And people forget history, so it's not as popular, but anybody can find this evidence. So that's why I usually like to ask people, if I could show you like literally the origins of this story are nothing but a lie, would you still believe it? And here it is. Here he is. Lamarck, evolutionary naturalist. Nature, by its own means, has successfully produced all species of animals, beginning with the simplest and ending with the most complex. And since Charles Lyell hated the Bible, and he was a lawyer, he was a great manipulator of the data. So he went to Niagara Falls one day and he started going, I wonder what the decay rate of the falls are. So he went and he asked a couple local geologists at the time, what do you think the decay rate for this falls are? And he drew up and documented, and they said probably like 3 feet a year. So what did he do? Well, guess what he did? He went back and documented it only decays at 1 foot a year. He just made up some numbers, slow the rate down to push it to 35,000 years. And his lie worked pretty good until they discovered a little bit later that the rate is actually about 5 feet a year. It's actually even the geologists at the area were wrong, and it was over 5 feet. So the more recent, they showed that it was moving at about 4.7. So his prediction to slow it down to 35 years was nothing but a made up lie. He just made it up and put it directly in the literature with no sources or anything. And his agenda worked. It actually worked really good. And we read right here, I am sure you may get into quarterly report, what will free the sciences of Moses. This was his agenda that was privately written in a letter to somebody else. And we found it after his death. So that was what his goal behind everything was, because of his hate. So Lyell sold a type of snake. Lyell also sold geology some snake oil. He convinced geologists that all past processes acted in their current rates. That is, the observed is in historical time. That was posted in 1993. So we were on to him at this point. The extreme gradualism that led to numerous unfortunate consequences, including the rejection of sudden or catastrophic events in the face of the positive evidence for them for no reason other than they were not gradual. See, he removed catastrophism because the Bible talked about a global flood. So he knew if he could get rid of catastrophism, that he could convince the public and the church, which was hard at the time, that there was no global flood. And he did exactly that. And he did it with great style because he was a lawyer. So he was able to convince people. He convinced them so much that he convinced Charles Darwin. And how did geology influence Charles Darwin? Well, it says right here, actually, in geology, the website for Darwin, that Darwin's geology was also important in the development of his theories of evolution. So him looking at Charles Lyell for evidence is what influenced more of his ideas. And guess what? To this very day, there were people in 1924 that had the concept that humans evolved from the 3 types of apes: Asians from orangutan, blacks from the gorilla, and Caucasians from the chimpanzee. So that concept of Lyell was still working on people all the way up until 1924. And absolute lunacy, all from a lie. So, and then Darwin, what did he do? Well, he pretty much plagiarized people. That's kind of what he did. He plagiarized creationist Edward Blythe. He was the first person, used words that only he used. John Ray, look at this one, defines species as a group of organisms reproducing true to their type. He was the first fixity of species. Ray was the first to introduce or define species biologically rather than just by appearance. And his view became the dominant view, but other creationists still thought species could change. So interesting place I have that. So here's evidence that Darwin plagiarized from Blythe. He actually even stole words that Blythe made up. So no one could say like, no, he stole the idea. No, he stole words, literally fake words. So there's no way anyone can say he didn't plagiarize them, because that's like impossible to make up the exact same fake word as somebody else, say it's yours. Then he plagiarized as Alfred Russel Wallace. He plagiarized like 3 people. Patrick Matthews was another one. And these were published. These were in newspapers for a long time. Did he plagiarize? Plagiarized. Survival of the plagiarist. This was like, people knew that he stole. The only thing he got right was what he stole. It's amazing. So I say that evolution theory is low quality, low confidence, soft science that has failed 99% of its predictions. That is a miserable, miserable model that doesn't even belong anywhere near science. And I just wanted to conclude with that, because it's like, I can show you its history. It's not hidden. Anyone can look for it. I found it. I didn't know about it. I wasn't taught that in school. And I think because if people know, that'll open up the door, their mind, to being like, wait a minute, it started as a lie. When did it become true? It didn't. It never did. They just look for evidence because it's the only thing we're taught. Of course, you're going to find evidence for something. If everyone on Earth tomorrow started believing men were on Mars, and that was where humanity started, you know how much evidence would start to flow in for that? They'd be like, look at that. That's not a mountain. That's a man-made structure. Look at that 90-degree angle. Man, they'd be all over the place. It'd be like, see the watermarks going down there? That was man-made river right there. It would just be flowing in like nonstop. And that's exactly what we have. We have 99% of scientists looking for the evidence for one thing. Of course, you're going to find some evidence, but it's always been retrofitted. That's why they're so bad at predictions. If the model was really good, why can't they predict things? Why do they have to steal them from us? How come when they predict fast mutation or slow mutation rates, they're the exact opposite? How come when they predict slow speciation rates, we find the exact opposite? How come when they look in the fossil record for Darwinian slow gradualism, they find punctuated equilibrium and stasis? They everything the exact opposite. Nothing makes any sense in their model because it's so plastic, it can just retrofit anything. That's why they say the evidence is everywhere. Oh yeah, because everything is evidence. I forgot. When you can explain everything, it makes a pretty good model, you know? You know how easy it would be to falsify us? We have a very narrow time window for when things could have happened. Anything outside of that, it's kind of like, okay, life can't be old for us. It just can't. The earth could be, but not life. We're stuck with a narrow window of creation and a flood. That's it. And very easy.
Well, a lot of people think that they have already, the evidence is so much against us, and, they'll list off the evidence of geology, the evidence of archaeology, the evidence of astronomy. Like they'll like list off the evidence. And so what has been your experience with that? Like, do you think that there's evidence against us?
I just ask them, show me what that evidence is and explain why it's good evidence to you. And then you'll really quickly find out that without assumptions and inference, you don't actually get that. They said, well, we calibrate, the annual layers of the ice cores to tree rings, so we know they're you go back millions of years. I'm like, so you mean to tell me there's trees that go back a million years that you can tree ring date? Well, no. How old's the oldest tree? About 5,000 years. So you can only calibrate for 5,000 years. Well, yeah. Okay, so now you're telling me that your calibration point is young, but yet you're telling me it goes back hundreds of thousands. Well, yeah, but we can calibrate to other things too. Oh, okay. So they've just got another example of how once you get to the details, it just kind of crumbles apart really, really fast. So another example of that would be like, they say we count annual layers. Okay, how many do you count? Oh, no exact number? How come? What's going on? They go, well, anybody that's good with ice cores knows that you don't count every single layer, because after a certain amount of layers, the weight from the above ice has compressed down, and now there's no longer layers to count. So now they have to make assumptions. Are these layers that we can count as annual as well? And if so, then what happens when we get to this ash layer that's in here from a volcanic eruption that seems to span for hundreds of thousands of years? That doesn't make any sense. A volcano went off for hundreds of thousands of years. Like, that's what's going on here? They're like, oh, it's just an anomaly. You can't just like make things up and just like, oh, it's okay, it's fine. Just, oh, well, those things happen. Oh, no. So your uniformitarianism belief of things that we don't see today are now okay to say that things like that did happen in the past. So now your catastrophism as well. See how they did that? They just mixed in it when they need it. So they're non-catastrophism uniformitarianisms until they need catastrophic events, and now catastrophic events are fine. See what they did? Retrofit the data. We need a bottleneck? Make one up. Where should we put it? When did humans arise again? Fossil record says 200,000. Right there. There's our bottleneck. What's the evidence for? You find any? Nah. Doesn't need to be one. We just said it was. Good enough for me. Everyone will believe it. Sheep out there, they're idiots. They won't care. They'll tell whatever Google says. They'll just Google it, and whatever it says, they'll believe. Idiots.
Yeah, I mean, evolution seems to be able to accommodate anything right now. So, yes. That's the issue, that it's just very, very flexible.
Unfalsifiable is the word, which means it's not science, because it can't be falsified. It's the only theory in all of science not protected by law. That's a red flag. It's the only theory that when something falsifies, they just say, well, we've learned more. Oh, yeah? Interesting. What happens if we were to be falsified on something? Oh, no, man, your theory is bunk. It's over. It's game over for you guys. Oh, okay. So it's only one way. See what I mean? Pseudoscience to the max. It's the only thing where that qualifies as well, too. Imagine if they did that in other theories. Oh, my gosh. Like falsified time and time again, they would just throw it away. They'd be like, this, no way. But, when they just wiggle and change definitions and words and everything, makes it pretty easy. They've never gotten a single prediction right on Neanderthal. I told that to my last guy in the debate, Conspiracy Cats. He was like, that's going to need some citations. I'm like, well, okay. I made a whole slide right there. I was ready to go. I went straight to my book and copied like 20 of them. I go, there you go. 20 pieces of evidence that literally shows directly that when they predicted something, the exact opposite was found every single time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for all the information that you provided. And I'll put some links to some of your papers and books in the description of this video. So thank you.
Cool.